Welcome to this episode of Loops and Life Cycles. Today I have with me Mathieu, who has quite an extensive background. We're going to talk about training, education, and how we can improve ourselves and our business by continually looking for those spaces for growth. The beginning of this conversation is actually going to be on Matthew's podcast, which is Wide Walls, and I will have a link to that in the description below. What you are hearing is the second half of our conversation, and if you enjoy it, please reach out and go check out the first half of the conversation on Wide Walls. Mathieu, could you tell me a little bit about yourself? Let the listeners know your background, what you're up to now.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Mathieu Penot. I live in San Francisco. I'm born and raised in France, and I'm currently a product manager for the edtech company called IXL Learning. And I'm someone who's really passionate about learning, especially like hands-on learning and creative learning. That's a field I've worked in for the past 8 years. Spent like 3 years in Singapore developing an app to help young children learn science through hands-on activities and doing a lot of workshops and camps and activities with kids around making and learning. Before that, I was an engineer, so that was my first degree as an industrial product designer. Didn't do much of that, mostly doing stuff with cardboard and paper after that with kids. But that gave me a good framework and a good baseline for a lot of things afterwards. Yeah, I'm very passionate about education in general and super excited to talk about all these topics with you.
So I'm spending a lot of time building out labs and some on-demand material. You are building some training, like educational software. How do you think we could try to apply that, getting that emotion, getting that interest, getting that storytelling into impersonal sort of education?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's really hard, especially when you work on a software at a certain scale. Like mine is a very large scale software that's used by literally millions of students, and so it's really hard to personalize. And I think so. Obviously, the first thing you do is to turn to motivation. So more like badges, levels, leaderboards, those kind of things, which work to a certain level. It does create a little bit of motivation and it does help, but it's definitely not going to create much like emotional attachment to the learning itself, because it doesn't matter what you're learning. It could be one subject or another, because what you're interested in is that reward, not so much how you get there. So the question of like how do you make that, like the journey, interesting is much harder. I have big hopes with generative AI that it could provide, like, reframe the problems you're working on, the whatever you're working on in that specific tool that you're creating. Basically reframe the problems in the experience to be more personal by knowing certain things about you, by knowing certain things you're interested in, and be able to, and we're back to that story element, right? Be able to build a little story that is going to be only for you. And generative AI is able to do that in ways that are in like normal language, in like human language that is understandable by anyone.
Sure.
Is it easy to do? It's
Would
hard.
you worry about privacy in a situation like that?
There's definitely a lot. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of elements that are tricky with that. You don't control the output, so you don't really know what's. You're not sure 100% what's going to come out of it, so that's tricky. You need to be careful with what kind of information you collect as well, for sure. Yeah.
There's a way, I think, of making it repeatable and personal and interactive. I think of Skyrim and the Fallout game, Dead Redemption. These games where you've got NPCs that interact with you based off of your actions. And hasn't employed generative AI yet. But if you could have that sort of thing for your player character in this educational software, where maybe you've given your character a name that's not necessarily you, but now you've taken that on, and then it can interact with you in that way where it feels personal without getting actually personal, and your facts, your information about you in this pretend world.
Yeah, that's true. That makes sense. I like that. It makes me think back on I mean, not back, just make me think of the assistant that Khan Academy created with generative AI, Cadmigo. I don't know if you like heard of it, like seen some of it, but they've been doing some amazing like groundwork on like using generative AI to create that teaching assistant that's personalized to children. And the part I was most excited about for that is the creating a thought partner for creative writing. And I relate a little bit to that. So you're not like necessarily immersed into a game or like something more immersive like this, which would be like ideal. Actually, games are such an amazing way to teach. By the way, it's like such a powerful tool for learning that's probably not used enough for it, but that's another big. But basically, the idea is that it gave you like that thought partner that does not need to know things about you, but can bounce back on what you say and suggest ideas, build on your ideas, push you to like come up with new ideas and things you want to write about. And in the end, it becomes personal because it's only going to be the result of that conversation that you have with that AI tool. So it's going to be different for everybody. And eventually it's going to make you move forward with your writing. And by doing that, definitely like you're going to learn. If you talk about creative writing in particular, it's definitely going to help you get better at it. So that's something that I find very exciting, and I wonder how applicable it is to other subjects as well.
Yeah, I think it can be if you're willing to take the time to make it. It's been one of my takeaways over the past several years is so many of these things cross over. What you're describing, looking at this process and seeing how we can improve it, is that not the Six Sigma way? Just process improvement. You're doing project management on like software development, right?
Yeah.
So I imagine there's sprints and there's cycles. In that same way, there's going to be either features or bugs that are going to be worked on during that sprint. And that's an outcome that you're working towards based off of what's been in the past. If we can take the same idea, could we gamify how we do that process? Rather than using these features for education, could we use the same idea, what we're talking about in gamifying the training and the education? Can we gamify just work, building, the gamifying?
For sure.
And
ways, yeah.
Is there a way of doing that you don't have to go so far out there that you have to build a whole thing, but is there a way of implementing it in just the way? I think earlier you talked about trying to employ certain things in a classroom and trying to employ that gamification or that play, the hero's journey, that arc and storytelling. Can't necessarily do it in every lesson. And I don't know that we would want to do it in every single meeting or every single sprint. But is there something that we could take from that? Is there a core element of that? First principles, if you will? The reason why that works that we could take with us?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't really have an answer to that, but I'm sure it's possible.
Yeah. I don't either.
I'm sure it's possible. And maybe it's going on a tangent instead of before with that question, but it makes me think.
This is what I do.
Makes me think of the social aspect of it as well, because in that the social aspect is also very important to get someone engaged, whether it's at work or at school or like learning. And so I think when we talk about gamification, like we think of those immediately, we think of those badges and stuff like that, and then we can think of like
badges,
what you meant, and then like the idea of like more of some form of like story or narrative that's like leveling up the gamification for sure. And I think maybe there's definitely an element on the social aspect of it that can be very useful. I know like in companies, like in my company or like other companies I've seen, there's the certain concepts of like giving tacos to people who did something great for you, and at the end whoever gets the most tacos gets like some form of reward, like a bottle of champagne or something. Like it's some kind of like social element to it that makes you want to like work with others and also work better and collaborate more. And so there's a form of gamification there, I think, in building up and encouraging those social interactions within work.
Man.
And
sorry, my brain goes all over the place. It makes these weird connections. I recently saw a video of an old Budweiser commercial. It's in an office and someone swears and they're like, put $1 in the swear jar. And they're like, what are we going to do with that? I don't know. So now everyone's like swearing so they can put money in there. And at the end, it's like an all call and everyone's holding a beer.
I love that.
Like the boss is like giving this great speech and everyone is interested.
Yeah.
He just keeps swearing so that putting more money in there. But this idea, it pulled people together.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the tacos, the like props, the golden like stickers, like stars. If you make it be like a weird thing, that's not going to work. But if you can find something that the office, that the team is interested in, that's like a little bit of playful, that takes away that tension, that makes it a little more comfortable, that makes it personal, more personal to them.
Create a sense of community, right? You want to create a sense of community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't want people to take unnecessary steps in their programming and create more technical debt and bugs. But we do want them to care about their coding. And yeah, could we throw out some kudos, some points for folks who are doing a great job?
Yeah. Example of the coins is very interesting because it makes me think of something that I saw in a, can't remember which museum it was. Maybe it was the Exploratorium in San Francisco or another museum. But I found it like so brilliant. Basically, he had 3 like big jars where you could put $1 or something like this. But basically the rule was, so it was something around climate change. And it was like, those are like 3 measures we can do. You can only give $1. Which one you're going to give it to? And so that forces you, because you're like, oh, like I want to make sure I give it to the right place. And so that forces you to like
only got so many resources. Yeah.
What it is about, think what would make the most impact, engage with the content, and then eventually like you put it somewhere. But
that's huge for a museum because you could bring all these ideas and then really applying like what can we take from this?
And it goes back to
seen all these displays, you've thought of all this stuff. Now you've actually got to interact with it.
Exactly.
Like where would you put
and it goes back to stakes, right? Like suddenly there's something at stake. Even if it's as small as $1, there's something at stake. Like you have to make the right decision. Yeah. So that I found this like brilliant. Simple and brilliant. Yeah.
Do you know who Mark Rober is?
Oh yeah.
The former NASA and
YouTuber.
Yeah. He's got his TED Talk on the Mario effect.
I've not watched it. I
for
need
gamification.
To watch it. Yeah, I watch all his YouTube videos, and I encourage everybody to watch his YouTube videos. Start with the squirrel one, and you're gonna love it. Yeah,
it's highly addicting. I like that even in those videos, he tries to find a nugget for takeaway.
The learning now.
It's this exactly.
I know precisely what squirrels do when they jump and fall. I know that they jump. The first thing they do is like orient their head towards the ground to see where they're gonna land. Then turn the body to. I remember that precisely, and that's because the video was so fun and engaging. And I was like, why would I know that? But because he brought it in.
Right?
Yeah.
And like the crazy takeaways from that. Is it entertaining? Yes, but squirrels. There's this video Mark Rober does. Because people might not know what we're talking about. He's a former NASA engineer. He's got a YouTube channel. And during the pandemic, he was at home bored. And he noticed the squirrels in his backyard. And so he made an obstacle course for squirrels and videotaped it over several months. And it's a great piece of YouTube. It's a good way to waste a half hour. And in the end, you'll learn about some squirrel anatomy and how they work. But also like the watching the squirrels in there and how they interact and how they problem solve as they're going through. Ooh, what do we do? Like how could we set up scenarios like this in order to train to an objective? And then also we can get real meta. There were things that Mark set up hoping the squirrels would act a certain way or do something funny, and then they did something totally different. He was like, whoa, was not expecting that. How often do we run into that in training or in education?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
You have a certain goal, and then you throw this thing out there, and all of a sudden the takeaway was not what you...
And show the practice of reflection, which I love too, because when, specifically in his videos, again, for me, it's one of the most perfect examples of like a great way to teach things. He always shows things that don't work and shows the reflection behind like why it didn't work and how it's actually fun that it didn't work and fun that we need to find another way to make it work, and then go through that process of, okay, how can we do it in a different way, do it better, which is so important. And it's like that whole like practice and process.
Failure isn't Yeah, it doesn't stop
No,
there. It is a step towards doing things
yeah,
better.
failure is what makes enduring interesting, among other things, because that's where you have to scratch your head and come up with some innovative solutions to solve the challenge.
We got a Nintendo Switch for Christmas, which I know is like old news now, but with our kids and my easy addiction to video games, is I remember getting a Super Nintendo when I was their age, and that was the new stuff. So we finally got one. My daughters love one of these Zelda games where it's like from the top. They don't like actually playing other than like in the safe space in the village because they're worried about getting hit by one of the bad guys and like losing their hearts. And I've shown them like worst case scenario. Like a little screen comes up, you hit continue, and it pops you right back to where you were before. Like nothing bad's gonna happen, but they're so scared of that failure. You gotta have that to learn how to. And it's one of those where, do I want them to get good at the game? I really don't care. I want to watch that process in their little brains.
Yeah.
Like trying the thing and being like, oh, it didn't work. Now I want to try it again. That's my favorite part of watching games.
Yeah.
Is when you can see that worked out across their face. You've done a lot of workshops. Have you seen things along those lines? Kids like struggling and then hitting that eureka
Oh,
moment?
for sure. Especially when working on all those like hands-on projects. Once they have a goal in mind, an objective that they want to achieve, like, oh, I want to build that robot. I want to make that thing move a certain way. Like once they have that in mind, they will go through so much effort to get there. And
Yeah.
the older they get, the less like willing they are to like just try and see how it goes. There's gonna be a little more anxiety,
Yeah.
or more like planning, and let's make sure everything's aligned properly before I try. When they younger, it's just oh, let's put it that way, boom, oh, that doesn't work, okay, let's just remove that, oh, try again. And they go through the cycles like much faster because they're less worried. Again, that's a generalization. You're gonna have some kids that are gonna be very particular and all, but you tend to like when you get older, have less. Yeah.
What do you think is behind that? Do you think it's a societal like not wanting to fail, or is it like not wanting to look like a failure in front of peers, or do we train kids, or maybe does society train kids to like be wary of that?
I feel it's because you're getting more and more aware of others and like others' perception of you, and so that becomes a consideration. Where when you're like 3, 4, 5 years old, you don't care what people think of what you do as much. So you just do your things. And so when you start caring about what people think of what you do, suddenly it becomes much more stressful to really give into all the things you want to create. So I think that's a big one. And there's definitely, it could be like something that's purely internal and not really based on reality. The thing is, you also receive a lot of judgment, like whether it's from school, when you're at school, whether it's from parents. I've seen some kids that create something and the parents being like, that's not really, no, let's do it that different way. But next time you're going to think twice before you build it that way and present to your parents, because you're like, oh, so I did wrong. You know, at the beginning, I don't care. The more you do it, like, the more I don't want to do it wrong, because you also don't want to disappoint. So yeah, I feel definitely that it's an external pressure that you get on yourself. And like when we're adult, there's nothing we do. I don't feel we do anything really freely, or very little. Like most of us, we always have a thought behind of what will such and such like think about it. And it can be like a small group, or it can be like what everybody's gonna think about it. Sometimes it's just like what will my partner think about it? What will my parents think about it? What will my colleagues think about it? There's always gonna be a little, how is this gonna be received, rather than just yourself. What do you think about it? And sometimes it's good. It also creates some boundaries in what you create, but you definitely don't have that much, I'd say, agency in like the thing you do.
There's a term that we use in cybersecurity, risk appetite, where an organization will choose to do something at a certain level of risk based on their risk appetite. And it can be things from like big companies wanting to buy a new company. Is this something that we can afford to be wrong on? And how much are we willing to be wrong on? If we were to make this merger, say we've got the money, we can do it. And we're at the point, yes or no. Then comes the decision of all those other things that come into it. What will this mean to the rest of our company? And if this bombs completely, what's going to be the impact on the existing organization or the new organization? We take that into cybersecurity. You've got all these threats that could happen potentially. Like, how likely are you to be a target? Like, how much do you have to lose? How much do you want to spend to protect the things that you could lose? There's this idea you don't want to have $1,000 fence for $100 course. In the same way, you don't have bank vault doors on your front door, right? But you do have a deadlock. And so there's a certain risk appetite, something that we're comfortable doing. And in that same way, some people in business will have a certain risk appetite. I know mine is very low. After flying airplanes, be like, no one's going to die. Everything's recoverable. Idea that I've got with life means that I'll make some choices that other people are like, we didn't think about like all the possibilities. We can just roll it back. We don't have that much to lose. It doesn't cost anything to do. Like, why don't we try it? For some reason, I have this picture of a young kid learning to play pool or billiards. And like, as a young kid, you get the stick, you see the cue, you've got the cue stick, you see the cue ball and like the other balls on the table, and you might be willing to like hit it and look silly and it go nowhere and not hit the right things. But if you don't do that, at some point you don't learn how to do it, right? And it becomes a lot harder down the line if you're scared of looking silly and you don't know how to do this thing that you feel like other people might judge you, being like, "Oh, you don't know how to do that yet?" That's harder. Can we put people in a situation and build them up and create training and education in a way where we can force them to feel less anxious, less stressed about making a poor mistake in order to try?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I love the idea of playing, like having to play freely in a silly way or free-form way with whatever you're gonna engage with or learn. To evacuate that first, just do whatever you want with it, and then once that's done, okay, now it was fun. Don't you want to get a little more in depth with it? I think as well, a lot of games do that too, where you can play a game like mindlessly and just play and that's fine. You could still get value out of it, but after a while, if you do that, you'll be like, what's the next thing I can do? How can I get like to that next level? I'm bored of just playing that way. Yeah, you're always looking for a little bit of challenge, and so you can probably play in that like natural appetence for challenge, but by giving that like no stake free from play before.
Well, that's a little bit of like the Super Mario effect. If you give players unlimited lives and no rewards, they're going to get bored. But if you've only got 3 Marios and then like you start over from the beginning, and you get coins along the way and you get stars at the end, then now you don't know why, but you want to get more stars and you want to get more coins. They're not going to affect your life at all. But for some reason, now you're emotionally invested and you don't want to lose those Marios because you earned all these coins and stars. And now you're interested in getting better at that thing. Why?
Yeah. Then it's a form of pride, right? It's a form of like self-satisfaction. Like, I can do it. I'm able to do this. Now I'm able to do more. Because as a human being, you want to feel that you're competent at things. If you feel you're competent at nothing, that's really hard. Like you want to find some areas where you feel some form of competence. So there's maybe some of that involved too.
Yeah. One thing with skill-based training is obviously if you throw someone in the deep end of the pool without any lessons, you're likely to scare them. Their chances of failing are super high. And so if we put things in people's places, if you put the training and a little bit of the assessment of the training, the education, at a level where it's a little bit challenging so that they stay engaged, but rewarding enough when they complete it, when they solve it, then they'll want to continue.
Yeah.
If they're not challenged, they're going to get bored. If they're too challenged, they're going to be discouraged.
Yeah, there's a lot of like theory and learning around that. There's like something called the zone of proximal development by Zygotsky. I hope I get his name right. Zygotsky.
I will tell him.
Something like that. Sorry for the ones who who care about his name. But basically, it's the idea that you learn best when you're slightly out of your like level of comfort and competence,
Yeah.
And you have support. So it's basically, if you're in your comfort zone, you're not going to learn much. If you're too far out, you're not going to learn much because it's going to be too stressful and too difficult. If you're slightly out, plus you have some support, like some resources or someone to help you, that's where you're going to learn best. And it also makes me think of the idea of flow. We talked about it with another guest, Chris Bennett, in another episode. It was super interesting because so the idea of the flow is also to have that right level of challenge so that you constantly engage and eventually you get into that like time and space where you can go like 3 hours on something, completely forget about everything else and have that complete immersion. But what was very interesting is that he said the problem is that you don't want people to be in the state of flow when learning. It doesn't help to learn because when you're in the state of flow, you do things the most like automatically in some ways, and you don't necessarily have that challenge, that reflection, that. And I was like, oh, that's super interesting because I would assume that if you're in that state of flow and you study, that's great. Like you're gonna learn so much. It was like not necessarily,
right?
Because you need to hit those like roadblocks a little bit to really get that element of learning.
Yeah.
So that,
Interesting. I'm thinking of a lot of stuff that we do with work is pretty repetitive. I don't know that many people feel like they're learning at work, which might be indicative of the problem. Because theoretically, if you're doing something repetitively, you should be getting better at it, right? And that in and of itself is training, if in another sense. So what is it that takes work and makes it different than training and education? Obviously, a lecture or a lesson on a specific topic is very different than a day at work. But that what we would do with an interactive lesson, a lesson that challenges and pushes someone and gets them interested in the subject to try to figure it out and solve it on their own. Is that something that we could apply in the business world in our day-to-day lives? You're right there as a program manager, like during a sprint, are there requirements or a goal or something that could be passed down to a developer in such a way that they want to solve it, that you've employed that Mario and put them right in that challenging where they're interested in doing it?
Yeah, so it makes me think of two things that we are doing. One thing is that in that sprint, so basically a sprint, if for the ones who don't know, it's a time period for example, it's 2 weeks where you start the sprint with a list of features you want to develop or bugs you want to solve, and the goal is to complete that list within the 2 weeks, and then you keep iterating like that. And basically we have multiple engineers we have multiple teams, and in which each team we have multiple engineers, and they are the one picking up which features, bugs, tasks they want to work on during that sprint, and they are encouraged to work on pieces of the product that they don't know as well. So the goal is for them is basically telling them, don't work on the one you're comfortable with or the one you worked on in the previous sprint, because then you're not going to learn as much. But go work on this other one,
right? And
the person is going to take the task that you worked on before, is going to learn from you. It's going to ask you questions. So it also creates those interactions and co-learning, co-teaching among the team. So that's a great example. And I think another one is also to keep challenging the way things are done. So trying to always be like, okay, we keep working on these new features, new extra. Okay, now let's just take a step back, look at one of our process, one of our systems, and say, is there a way to improve that? And so it again challenges the way things are done and forces like engineers to think on like new ways that things can be done. And that's also part of learning. So I think those are two ways that help to keep that like learning element here. What do you think? What are some ways that we could implement as well that could help to keep learning?
I'm thinking about, I work with a lot of clients doing consultancy as well. And if I could get them to do a little bit more problem solving and guiding them along that. It's something that you want to do as a consultant. Don't want to be like, do all these things and you'll be like set. Instead, you want to help them problem solve and give them a new perspective for thinking. Maybe having seen multiple like examples of a scenario, their business, hopefully they don't run into these problems over and over and over with security. Hopefully they get to a point where they're like, I don't know what to do. Okay, it's fine. This company have all been through it, and I've worked with them and helped them through it. Let me guide you through that. But it is at the same point, if you just give them an answer, they might be, there's room for, I don't agree with it. Help guide them towards solving it by guiding the discussion, asking them what they care about, asking them what outcomes they want, asking them like what is working, what isn't working in your current scenario. Like, why have you all used your budget towards that? Like, how do your interests in like the cybersecurity fit with the company's interest in this next go-to-market or with this next product? And in that, have I solved anything necessarily for them to help them figure out a little bit of that process on their own? Because I've seen examples, and that's what kind of came to mind for me.
It's interesting.
Like how I would put it into practice.
So it combines some of the things we've talked about, like almost at the beginning, around one, like being engaged in the experience, and also like kind of almost co-designing or co-agreeing on the objective and solving towards that, so that they are interested in the objective as well and in the outcome. So you bring that back on.
It's funny, a lot of the instructional design theory, it often makes me think of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People.
A
lot of those same principles, being interested in the other person, getting them to say yes, getting them to be your side, as not by convincing, but by showing them that they're interested. Anyways, it's crazy the how taking that same idea, just turning it a little bit for the scenario, it fits perfectly here. And if you just turn it like that, it fits perfectly over here as well. It's wild how things like that work in our world. One of the things I like about where I'm at in cybersecurity and training, because there's so much of that cross correlation.
No, for sure. It comes back always to getting interested in the other person. It always comes back to that human connection. That's always the key.
Yep. I wonder, what would you, for all of this discussion, be thinking about implementing? I always think about what's a little bit of the takeaway, or what could I use from even this discussion tomorrow?
That's a $1 million question.
I know. Sorry. That's a lot for a Friday night.
That's a good question, though.
You really got me thinking about, and I feel like we came into it together, like, how do we create stories and some of that gamification? How can we apply that in some of the typical situations?
I think definitely like the story part of the narrative, like how do you create a narrative or a story around some of the things you want to teach or learn. Because you can also create a narrative for yourself, right? If you want to learn something, you can also apply that to yourself and try to build a narrative for yourself. And that's very interesting. It still feels a little abstract. I'm not really sure exactly like how concretely it would look like, but but I think there's something there for sure.
In your own.
And I think the other thing is that maybe is like directly applicable is thinking back on that sense of community and social playfulness. Don't know if that would be the right terms, but like with whoever you work with, whether it's like colleagues or clients or whoever, like other stakeholders or students, what can you do to build up a little moment when you're gonna get to learn about each other more? That's one. So if it's at the beginning of a meeting, what are you gonna do to just create a little moment when someone shares something, or that moment that in the building where you're gonna make sure like you stop and talk to someone and get to know that person at a different level. But also, what can be some symbols or practices, or I'm not sure what the term is, but something you can create that build up that sense of community that you can gather around. It can be an activity that a team does every week. It can be, I love that example. That's in another podcast, another episode that actually is not out yet, but it's going to be out like next week normally, with Kali Cherokee, who's an amazing like children's TV host, and a lot of other things that she does. And we were talking about that trend that we've seen on TikTok of the teachers doing like an individual check to their students when they come in class, and everyone has a personal check. And that's such a great way to just start the day in a very unique, personal, exciting way. Yeah. So how does that look like if it's at work? How can you have something personal with each one that either with each one or for a group that bring you together and create that bond and that sense of let's work together because we are a unit in a way.
I had a boss who would start every meeting on Monday morning talking about and people liked, but I haven't been a big fan of football for a long time. I grew up in Southern California, so back before when the Rams were there for the first time and then when they left. So I didn't have a football team. And growing up, so it's I like football, I know football, but on Monday morning, it wasn't like I watched 8 games the night before. And so it didn't hit with me. It would hit with others. Yeah. I think if we could find ways of just like that personalized handshake as they enter the classroom, find ways of engaging each person on their own level, coming into a meeting, starting a day. If there was a way of doing it in our training, some way to, oh man, now I want to try to put this into practice. Some way of building it so that it's personable to that exact person. It doesn't need to be as unique as some of those handshakes. I've seen those the videos and the TikToks. Something that just makes you go, oh, this is for me.
Yeah, something very simple. For example, if you're in a meeting with people around the world or in different places, different cities, you could just do a round and say, what's the weather like at your place right now? It's the most basic because that's what you would ask anybody. What's the weather like? Is the most basic question, but everyone can say, oh, right now it's raining and right now it's sunny and it's just a small thing. It just anchors the day in being present and sharing a little something about where you are, and that's the first thing that comes to mind. But there's a lot of ways that this can be done. Yeah.
But I think I like that we're thinking about it. The difference in a lot of folks is that I want to spend time talking with are that they stop and think about how can we make this better? How can we do this better? I really love that. And I think it's innate in all of us. Sometimes it gets way too much other things to work.
Yeah, no, exactly. Life happens and it gets much harder, yeah. But no, definitely it's
I'm glad we
such a wonderful conversation.
Glad we had this to do just that.
Yeah, no, totally. And it's funny how we went to so many different topics and subjects, and yet there's still a little bit of that thread through it. And at the end, you're okay, we can see this kind of big points, big topics that encompass the whole thing.
Hopefully, inadvertently, we took our listeners on a hero's journey.
Yeah.
But this has been great, and thank you for spending the time with us.
Yeah, thank you too, and I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation and join the conversation too. If you have some ideas, things you want to share, feel free.
Reach out to us. We're on socials, and we'd love to know what people want to hear in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Josh.